Hello, everyone. Right. This is only a lightning talk. It's only 10 minutes. So I'm Doug Winter from Isotoma. We're an agency in New York. We do application development, which is these days almost exclusively serverless. We're an Amazon partner, so we do migrations and all of those things as well. I'm going to talk about a project we did for the BBC that's still running. This is like a successful war story, a war that we won. It was a really successful launch. I'm just going to talk about some of the things that worked for us that are worth considering if you're doing something similar. Great, so this is the world of visual journalism. These kinds of things, graphs, maps, those kinds of things, very popular in journalism now. Journalists want to be able to use them in their news stories and their articles, but they often don't have the tools or perhaps the expertise to be able to create them themselves. And I know I don't. So our project was to create an editing environment, a tool to be able to build these things, and then embed them in BBC News stories. These are being distributed both on the BBC News website, they're going out on the app, which is very popular, but also Facebook and Apple News and all sorts of different media. Which is particularly challenging for graphics because you might have different aspect ratios, you might have different resolutions, you have different device capabilities. Here's some examples. Sorry, my speaker notes are on my phone. So, you might have seen some of these things on the BBC News website yourselves. This is a thing called a quote pick, which they use all over the place just to sort of spice things up a bit. And maps. Lots of maps. We haven't got maps live yet, but they're launching soon. We need to be able to tolerate lots of different, like I said, aspect ratios and keep it visually consistent. So here's an example of rendering the same quote pick in different environments. Here's a picture of the editing environment. And this is, like, if you imagine, a good half the project is building a WYSIWYG editing environment to build things. And there's David Attenborough. Everybody loves David Attenborough. That's editing a map, and that's editing David Attenborough. Right, so the BBC used to have quite a big on-prem infrastructure, quite a lot in data centers. It's all being migrated to AWS. Their existing platform was being retired. That used to run on PHP, believe it or not. They've got an existing system for producing quote picks and graphs. But we were hired to come in and build a new iteration of that that they wanted to be cloud native and on Amazon. Cloud native these days means serverless, and this was quite a good choice for a serverless application. Oh, it's exciting. It's quite a good choice for a serverless application. Nowadays, virtually everything we build, greenfield, is serverless, and if you aren't currently doing this, you should definitely at least look at it. There certainly are some workloads that aren't suited to a serverless implementation, but something like this, where it needs a reasonably responsive user interface for a relatively small user group, and then we need to do some complex rendering stuff at the back end, actually is quite a good fit. So, we used React for the front end and Express. And I haven't got any leads. I'm glad I've got a copy here. And we back-ended it in S3 and DynamoDB. I need my slides. Oh, we're good. Thank you. So, one of the things about a cloud-native architecture that is very different from how we might have done this 10 years ago is that it's no longer sort of a black box. So I come from a dev background, but also an ops background. And when you're doing ops, often what you're doing is you're taking what the developers produce, which is a big old pile of code that you don't really care about, and you've just got to get it in the right environment and configure it and make sure it runs, and then you're done. But there's not really any big old pile of code anymore. You have lots of moving parts at Amazon that you now need to coordinate. And that means that this orchestration is a first-class problem for you in Ops or DevOps in a way that it previously wasn't. And you need to address that properly from the beginning and have a design for it. You don't just let them write a load of code and then worry about it later. So in this case, we had a bunch of React client assets that need to arrive in a browser somehow. We need to do some authentication, which I'll talk about in a minute. We needed to get our visualization assets around. We needed to do publishing. We needed to do rendering. And we ended up needing to deliver those things to the BBC News website, which apparently has some users. And we needed a solution for all of this that would work in a development environment as well as a production environment. Now, traditional apps, dev and prod, are pretty similar. In this case, can we get something that's workable as a development environment that has low latencies for code updates, i.e. they're not actually running Lambda every time they make a change? So, API Gateway. If you've not used it much, API Gateway kind of looks like all it does is puts Lambda functions on an HTTP endpoint, but it's got quite a lot of additional functions that are extremely useful. It doesn't just talk to Lambda, it talks to loads of stuff. If you go and have a look in the integrations in API Gateway, there's a list of not all of the AWS services, frustratingly, but most AWS services you could talk to directly. And also S3. It supports wildcard proxy resources, and it's got an authentication layer, which is rather handy for us because we really needed it. The BBC has two sorts of internal authentication if you are an employee. One of them uses X509 certificates, so client certs in the browser, and the other is using a shared service called BBC Login, which is sort of a custom identity provider. Now, API Gateway does not support you running your own PKI yet, which was very annoying, so we couldn't implement the certificate-based auth. But this is going to be a common problem within the BBC if they're going to want to build more serverless apps. So the way we address that was to build an independent proxy that's a reusable component that sits in front of API Gateway, takes the requests from the user, and it does all the authentication stuff. So if they have a cert, is it the right cert, all that kind of stuff. If they don't have a cert, can they log in with the BBC login? And then if all of that stuff passes, we proxy the request through to API Gateway. Now, API Gateway is on the public internet, so we then need to authenticate our proxy with the API Gateway. And in this case, we used signed requests, which is a very straightforward approach. You can forward your permissions effectively. You can use your login users' permissions in back-end services with API Gateway. So you could use this approach if you have partitioned permissions, you've got admins and normal users, you could do that authentication on a per-request basis as a different user, and those permissions would propagate back through the rest of your system, which is extremely powerful. You can leverage the IAM permissions system to lock down users in a way that is, demonstrably, provably going to work. So that was very effective. I actually wrote the code on that. I don't write code much these days, but it wasn't very much code, and it worked pretty much first time, which was brilliant, and solved what is otherwise quite a hairy problem. Now, if anyone here looked at API Gateway, hands up, seen API, great. Okay, so you may recognize this. So that thing on the left there is when you open up your resource tree, and API Gateway has this concept of resources. It's a RESTful APIs, right? So it's got resources, and the resources have got methods. And if you look through them briefly, I can't see them on my tiny screen, here we go, you'll see that we have, look, there's a favicon.ico, right? We've got CSS, we've got JavaScript. It's a website inside API Gateway. And we map all those endpoints onto things that will reliably serve them. And this is how we handled our dev environment. And this worked brilliantly. And if you're just sort of dipping your toe into this kind of stuff, it's really worth a look. There's a package that Amazon produced called AWS Serverless Express, which wires Lambda into the Express routing system. So effectively, we wrote the entire application in JavaScript bundled it all together, and loaded it up as a single Lambda function. And then you can see at the bottom there, hopefully you can see, the screen's not too far away, I've got a proxy resource which just forwards anything that hasn't matched onto Express. Now, for the dev team, this was great. They can just go and build an Express application. It just works like Express in development, but then we can host it in Lambda. And we can do some other stuff as well. So up here you can see we've got our asset database. Now our assets here were just JSON blobs. And so we don't need to go through Express to get and put JSON blobs. You can see it says AWS service S3, hopefully. And what this is effectively doing is proxying directly from the React application to S3, but being authenticated through the existing authentication mechanism, so we can get and put our resources. And that's potentially quite powerful, because you could have a lot of different AWS services at the back there and use your existing authentication system to provide access to front-end applications. If you're writing single-page apps, often the back-end RESTful interfaces really are very noddy, and they are just things like gets and puts. And that's what a put looks like. There we go. So there's a very simplified diagram of what we ended up with. Now, the core part of this was serverless. That's the kind of middle Lambda layer there. But clearly, the authentication proxy couldn't be serverless, so frustratingly, there's a server in our serverless system. And then the broker at the back is a piece of existing BBC kit, which handled the interface with the publishing environment and getting things onto the BBC News website. I was very keen to use that. I didn't want to get any phone calls to say I'd brought the BBC News website down. That's no fun. So hopefully some of that's useful. I have some lessons from this. And like I said, it was really, really successful, this, and I would recommend the approach. So first of all, thinking about the dev environment. Again, it's not something, if you're in DevOps, maybe you don't necessarily think about, but actually make that development environment and your tooling first-class citizens in your design, include them in your thinking, and include them in your docs. API Gateway is a bit of a Swiss Army knife. The documentation is kind of impenetrable to begin with. It's the kind of documentation that once you know the answer, you realize that it was in the docs, but you don't necessarily find it the first time you look. But anything that you're doing that has a RESTful API, you almost certainly want to put this in front, because it gives you those extra capabilities that are otherwise quite hard to implement. It's really good having David Attenborough in your demos, in your marketing material. I could highly recommend David Attenborough in everything you do. He's extremely popular. Thank you.
Wonderful. Who doesn't love David Attenborough?
Exactly.
Right, questions? No one dares, because everybody wants to go for lunch, don't they? So, brilliant. Anyway, I think, are you around all day, Doug?
Sorry?
Are you around all day in case people want to ask questions? Right,
sure.
Awesome. Thanks again, Doug.
All right, thank you.
Have lunch. Right, so sorry about the interruption.
Oh, don't worry, that's fine.